Iran and the West, a history of repeated misunderstandings. Western misunderstandings of Iran are often explained as diplomatic mistakes, intelligence failures, or poor political judgment. Jimmy Carter allegedly misread Ayatollah Khomeini, Western governments misunderstood the Iranian Revolution, and European policymakers overestimated the prospects for moderation. These factors mattered, but they do not explain why similar misjudgments have recurred for decades. The deeper question is why many Western policymakers, intellectuals, and analysts have often shown greater understanding for anti-Western movements than for their own strategic interests. Why have movements defined by opposition to the West repeatedly been portrayed as liberation projects, while Western democracies are frequently presented as the primary source of global instability? Part of the answer lies in an intellectual transformation that followed the end of the Cold War. Although Marxism largely disappeared as an economic doctrine after 1989, its broader worldview survived. The traditional class struggle was increasingly replaced by new dichotomies: colonizer versus colonized, majority versus minority, privileged versus marginalized, and the West versus the non-West. Within this framework, many conflicts came to be interpreted primarily through historical power relations. Critical theory, post-colonial thought, and identity politics have contributed valuable perspectives. But when these become the dominant lens, anti-Western actors risk being understood mainly through what they oppose, rather than what they seek to achieve. The Iranian Revolution illustrates this dynamic. Before 1979, the Shah was widely portrayed as a symbol of authoritarianism and American influence. Khomeini, by contrast, was viewed in some intellectual circles primarily as an anti-imperialist leader. His explicit commitment to theocratic rule and rejection of liberal democratic values received far less attention than his opposition to the United States. The consequences are well known. After taking power, the Islamic Republic established an authoritarian religious state, curtailed women's rights, eliminated political opponents, and pursued a revolutionary foreign policy extending far beyond Iran's borders. Yet similar analytical patterns have continued to appear. During the Arab Spring, parts of the Muslim Brotherhood were often described as democratic reformers, despite profound ideological differences with liberal democracy. Hamas has frequently been analyzed more as a reaction to occupation than as an ideological movement with its own long-term objectives. In Afghanistan, Western state-building efforts underestimated the religious and tribal foundations of Taliban power. The common denominator is not support for extremism, but a recurring tendency to underestimate ideology as an independent political force. This is especially visible in European debates on Iran. Discussions often focus more on whether Western responses, from sanctions to military pressure, are justified, than on understanding the Iranian regime's own strategic ambitions. Legitimate criticism of Western leaders can therefore overshadow analysis of Iran as an autonomous geopolitical actor. For almost 5 decades, the Islamic Republic has made opposition to the West a central pillar of its domestic legitimacy and foreign policy, while strengthening ties with Russia and China. Yet analysis often concentrates more on Western reactions than on Iran's long-term strategy. Europe's greatest challenge is therefore not any individual political leader. It is whether Western democracies still possess the intellectual and strategic capacity to understand a world increasingly shaped by ideological and geopolitical competition. Iran is ultimately not only a Middle Eastern question, it is also a test of whether the West is willing to analyze its adversaries on their own terms, rather than primarily through the lens of Western self-criticism. Mahmoud Ashkanian, neuropsychiatrist, Ph.D.